200 years after the Persian invasion of Greece, after Alexander had led the Greeks clear to the borders of India, Greece faced another invasion from a perhaps surprising foe, the Celts. After spreading throughout Europe, roaming confederations of Celts had been threatening Macedon and northern Greek states for years when a leader decided to lead an invasion in the hopes of finding treasure. And just like the Spartans had done 2 centuries earlier in 480 BC, a coalition of Greeks went to meet this new invasion at the pass of Thermopylae. And once again, the ancient pass would be the site of a battle for the future of Greece. What has been called the forgotten Battle of Thermopylae deserves to be remembered. The origins of the Celts are unclear. Celtic languages first appeared in Greek and Roman records around 400 BC, and by then Celtic languages were spoken across Central Europe and the Atlantic coast, including modern France, Belgium, England, Spain, and Portugal. One theory suggests that Celtic cultures descended from the Central European cultures. Another posits that Celtic culture formed along the Atlantic coast and then spread east into Central Europe. Whatever their origin, after 400 BC, they began moving into southeastern Europe and northern Italy. The Roman Republic, then expanding in central Italy, faced a Celtic invasion in 390 BC, which culminated in the first sacking of Rome. The Romans eventually defeated the Celtic force and continued to subjugate more peoples and cities on the Italian peninsula. It's possible that groups such as the Celts were being forced to raid further and further afield thanks to resource scarcity and overpopulation. Archaeological evidence suggests that the European population grew significantly at this time. Across the Adriatic Sea, other Celtic groups were moving against and displacing tribes around the Carpathian Mountains, which lie along the borders of modern Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania. Celts also moved along the Adriatic coast and fought against the local Illyrian tribes. According to ancient writers, as many as 300,000 Celts may have moved into Italy and Illyria. The Celts were helped with the fractured political nature of the Illyrian tribes and the fact that the Illyrians were actively warring against the Greeks and Macedonians, leaving themselves weak to attack from the west and north. During the reign of Alexander the Great, Celtic tribes to the north of Greece largely stayed clear of Greece, which had a reputation for powerful militaries. In 335 BC, the Celts sent representatives to Alexander, who was leading an army against revolting peoples in Illyria and Thrace to his north. It's possible that these Celtic envoys were actually there, or at least simultaneously there, to assess the strength of the Macedonians, who at the time controlled mostly all of Greece except for Sparta and Crete. But the Celts didn't have to wait long for renewed instability to come to their southern neighbors. Upon Alexander's death in 323, his empire almost immediately fractured. While his generals battled over the remnants of his Asian and African empire, the region he'd left in charge of Macedon, Antipater, was faced with the rebellion of most of the Greeks. Though he would eventually put down the rebellion, his death a few years later led to a Macedonian civil war between his son Cassander and other claimants. In 298 BC, Cassander was forced to defend his kingdom against a major Celtic invasion, which he defeated. Other Celtic forces were successfully able to capture much of Thrace, where they founded the city of Serdica, the present-day capital of Bulgaria, Sofia. Cassander's own death a year later brought only more chaos, as his sons and other parties fought yet another civil war for the Macedonian throne. In 281 BC, the Celts began to exert an even greater pressure. The Thracian successor kingdom to Alexander's collapsed, and the Celts quickly moved in to its remnants. In 280 BC, the Celts, who were also referred to as the Gauls by ancient Greek writers, began their most ambitious attack on Greece yet, the so-called Great Expedition. The Celts had a vicious reputation already, with Justin writing that such indeed was the terror of the Gallic name that even kings, before they were attacked, purchased peace from them with large sums of money. About 85,000 Celts were involved in the invasion, split into 3 major groups. One Celtic force invaded Macedon, where they met the young king Ptolemy Kuranos. Kuranos has a poor reputation among contemporary writers, as he had schemed and betrayed his way to the throne. His epithet Kuranos means thunderbolt, a direct reference to his impetuous character. Justin says that he alone heard of the approach of the Gauls without alarm, and hurried on by the madness that distracted him from his unnatural crimes, went out to meet them with a few undisciplined troops. Kuranos also turned away the assistance of his allies, as he said he had led the sons of those who served under Alexander the Great. Kuranos marched to meet the Celts without his full force, and even rebuffed attempted diplomatic entreaties by the Celtic general. Though no detailed account of the battle exists, it was a disaster for the Macedonians, as they were cut to pieces. Kuranos was captured and beheaded, and his head paraded around the battlefield upon a spear. One historical account says that Kuranos was thrown off his elephant before he was captured. After returning home, a Celtic general or king called Brennus then proposed to lead another attack, this time on central Greece, which promised much loot. The size of the army is uncertain. Some ancient writers estimated as many as 200,000, with Pausanias writing 152,000 with 20,400 horse, although this number seems likely to be exaggerated. Greece was in a state of disarray. When the Celts drew near to Thermopylae, the Greeks in general made no move to prevent the influx of barbarians, since they had been severely defeated by Alexander and Philip. Additionally, King Pyrrhus was then fighting the Romans in Italy, and continuing struggles between the Diadochi kept Greece in constant warfare. According to Pausanias, the Athenians were the ones to step up to the new challenge, although they were more exhausted than any of the Greeks. The coalition that formed under the Athenian general included 7,000 or more Aetolians, 10,500 Boeotians, 3,500 Phocians, 1,000 Athenians, and a number of other Greeks, including 500 from the Seleucid Empire. And they marched to the most defensible site that they could imagine, the narrow pass at the hot gates of Thermopylae. Forces from Sparta and the Peloponnesian Peninsula didn't come, believing themselves safe beyond the Isthmus of Corinth. Brennus' ultimate goal was the city of Delphi, sacred to Apollo and promising significant riches. Thermopylae was likely not the same place as it had been 200 years earlier, when Leonidas had stood there. In the modern day, the pass has grown larger thanks to accumulating silt, but it still presented a narrow approach that would give their smaller force an advantage against the Celts. The position also neutralized the threat of the more numerous Celtic cavalry. The Greeks sent ahead a smaller force of about 1,000 men to destroy bridges across the Spercheius River. Brennus' forces outmaneuvered the Greek force by finding a shallow crossing and sending a force of 10,000 across, picking out the swimmers and the tallest men. The Celts were said to have used their large shields as makeshift rafts to successfully reach the south bank of the river. This forced the Greeks to return to the army at Thermopylae, and Brennus commanded locals to rebuild the bridges so that the bulk of his army could cross. The Greeks were certainly not unaware of the way that Xerxes had defeated the Spartans centuries earlier, and they did send a force to defend that pass that Xerxes had used to outflank the Greek force. Brennus reached Thermopylae and prepared his troops on the same ground that the Persians had centuries earlier. Celtic soldiers were generally very lightly armored, lacked the more sophisticated discipline and group cohesion of the Greek phalanx. They rushed at their adversaries like wild beasts, full of rage and temperament, with no kind of reasoning at all, Pausanias wrote. Even with arrows and javelins sticking through them, they were carried on by sheer spirit while their life lasted. Some of them even pulled the spears they were hit by out of their wounds and threw them or stabbed with them. But of course that description came from a Greek source who wasn't particularly kind to what he thought to be barbarian raiders. The Celts themselves didn't leave any written record of the battle. The Greek phalanx held against the frontal assault, supported by spearmen, archers, and slingers who unleashed devastating volleys on their lightly armored opponents. The Greeks were also supported by ships, which approached the shore as closely as possible to harry the enemy. The attack was a disaster for Brennus, and twice or 4 times as many Celts were killed for every Greek. Their disorganized retreat, according to Pausanias, killed as many men as they lost in the fighting. Pausanias records that the Greeks lost 40 men, but that it was impossible to tell how many Celts died because the number of them that disappeared beneath the mud was great. The defeat stymied the Celtic advance. Brennus, however, proved to be a clever adversary. Instead of facing the phalanx again, he dispatched a force to invade Aetolia, which he had hoped would draw off a significant portion of the Greek defenders. The Celts attacked a town at the border, Callion, and massacred the population, committing what Greek sources called atrocities without parallel and the crimes of men. The Aetolian force abandoned Thermopylae to defend their homeland and would defeat the Celts there soundly. Meanwhile, Brennus looked for a way to defeat his foe. Locals, desperate for the invaders to lead, offered to show Brennus an easier path around Thermopylae than the one his men had already attempted. According to Pausanias, the very path that the Persians had used to encircle Leonidas. Brennus took a large force and followed the path. The Phocians defending the path were caught by surprise, because a heavy mist rolled thick down the mountain, so they didn't see the enemy's approach. The Celts defeated the Greek force, but runners were able to reach the army at Thermopylae and warn them of the impending attack. The Greek force boarded their boats and abandoned the position. And so this battle of Thermopylae ended very much like the first battle of Thermopylae, except that the defenders were able to escape. Brennus led his army towards Delphi. The army at Thermopylae dispersed, but a new force formed to face Brennus' army, which did not wait to be reinforced by the soldiers left behind at Thermopylae. Delphi at the time had been brought into the Aetolian League, and the league mustered its whole strength to defend the city. 2 sources describe the battle that would come, Justin and Pausanias. Both sources record portents sent by Apollo, the clearest in recording history. According to both, storms were constant over the Celts, with thunder and lightning so loud that they couldn't hear orders, and the whole ground occupied by the Gallic army was shaken most of the day. Lightning struck among the Celts and set warriors aflame. The battle was vicious, and many were killed in the action, but the end of the day only brought more terror to the invaders. Landslides were said to strike them, and a severe frost and snow struck. The next day the Greeks struck hard, with the Phocians flanking the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Brennus was wounded, and the Celts were forced to retreat. By nightfall the camp was in chaos. Pausanias claimed that the god Pan made the Celts go mad, but perhaps the Celts merely began fighting amongst themselves over what treasure they still had, with their leader wounded and their advance defeated. Athens and other Greeks arrived to reinforce the Aetolians, and the Celts, now beset by enemies, retreated the way they had come. Brennus, wounded but not mortally, killed himself, possibly by poison or by stabbing himself, according to Justin. When the Celts reached the Spercheius, they found that the way was blocked by an ambush of yet more Greeks, and the army was destroyed. These historians' descriptions of supernatural events at the battle do invite skepticism, but it is at least clear that the Celtic invasion was stopped before it reached Delphi. The Celts had raided what they thought to be a vulnerable foe, only to find out that despite their troubles, the Greeks remained a formidable force. Many of the Celts involved in the invasion were said to have gone to Anatolia, where they formed the Galatian state in central Turkey. The Greeks maintained their independence for some time after the battle, but eventually would be absorbed into the growing Roman Empire, and the Romans, of course, would have their own conflicts with the Gauls for centuries to come. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history, and if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net, and of course we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo, and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.